listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Have you ever wanted to eat something that can sting? Then stinging nettles are for you! Rootbound is proud to be supported by Urtica dioica, the original stinging nettle. Rootbound is not responsible if you were stung by stinging nettle. Stinging nettles will sting your hands and mouth. Proper handling and preparation required. Don't eat stinging nettle if you have an allergy to stinging nettle.
Hi everybody, thank you for listening to Rootbound, the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. My name is Steve, and I am the host of the show. Each week on Rootbound, I invite a guest who joins me on the podcast to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. Do you have any Captain Kirks growing in your garden? How are your Bilbo Bagginses doing this year? Those are cultivar names for a hosta, the Captain Kirk hosta, and a dahlia, the Bilbo Baggins dahlia. And because of the plant I'm going to talk about later in the show today, it had me thinking about what plants have been named after, like, pop culture things. And it's pretty interesting, and I kind of have broke it up into three sections of how plants have been named after pop culture things. And the most common is those cultivars, right? These are cultivars of these are cultivars of plants that have a name like hosta, but it is a cultivar called the Captain Kirk hosta, or the Bilbo Baggins dahlia. And those, it's pretty easy to name one of those after a pop culture thing because basically anybody can create their own cultivar, and if you submit it to the right naming authority, you can kind of give it almost any name you want. There are some rules, but there's a lot of wild cultivar names out there, and those are pretty fun. A little bit harder is to get a pop culture reference into the scientific name for a plant, but how about Stelis Oscar Grouchy? Named after, of course, Oscar the Grouch, is a plant in the orchid family from South America. And if you look at it in a pot, I can see how it looks a little bit grouchy. Or then there's the Begonia Darth Vaderiana, which, of course, is a begonia that is trained in the dark side of the Force. But no, really, it's a pretty cool begonia that has like black leaves, but that's pretty cool. And naming a scientific name of a plant is trickier because, first of all, you have to like actually have a new plant, and there are plants that have not been quote-unquote discovered out there, but that's harder as time goes forward. And then also you have to get the name accepted, and there's a lot of rules for like scientific namings, and it has to be accepted by scientific bodies around the world. But there's a bunch of those, including the Oscar Grouchy and the Darth Vaderiana. But I think the trickiest thing to name a plant after a pop culture reference is the common name, because a lot of the common names have already been well established for like millennia, and so I don't think we're going to be seeing any like Captain Kirk's that is just like the common name, not a cultivar name or the scientific name. And the plant that we're going to talk about later today is one of those. It's named after a pop culture reference from the 1700s, but pop culture reference nonetheless. In fact, there's two plants we're going to talk about that are part of the same pop culture reference that are named after two different plants, which is pretty interesting. But I was trying to think of other ones like this, and I was really coming up a blank. The only two I could really come up with that made sense are the narcissus, which is named for flowers in the daffodil family, and they like bend over the water, and it's based on that Greek myth about Narcissus, who was so narcissistic he couldn't help looking at himself in the water, and then he turned into a flower because he just stood there for too long. And then Solomon's seal, which is a biblical reference to King Solomon. Pop culture references of their times, I suppose. But I wonder if this one I'm going to talk about is the latest example of a pop culture reference that is the common name of a plant, like the well-known common name, or if you can think of another example after you hear this episode, let me know, because it's actually a pretty fun challenge. Like, what is the most recent pop culture reference that we commonly call a plant? That's a challenge for you. And with that, let's meet our guest and first talk about a plant that has a very just descriptive name.
They look like a band to me.
You need to move back more.
Why?
Because when I do my double jump kick off the amp with slashing windmills, I'm gonna need more room.
Well, don't do that then.
Yeah, it sounds a little too Milli Vanilli, Zach.
And if I back up anymore, my extension cord might damage the miniature date palm.
The what?
That's what that's called. My aunt's got one.
Dude, don't call plants by their specific names. It's very not rock and roll.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for joining me on Rootbound.
Hello.
Do you have a plant to share with us today?
Yes, I would like to share Echinacea purpurea. See if I can say it correctly today. Purple coneflower.
Wonderful. That is a fun plant. I can't wait to hear about it. I have a little thing I'm going to say at the end of why, whenever I hear purple coneflower, there's something kind of random that pops into my head. And I'll explain that a little bit later. But I'm happy to hear about it from you. And first of all, why did you choose it? Why is this plant meaningful to you?
You know, when I was trying to think about, what is a meaningful plant to me, I love so many different ones because I'm a plant nerd and just like they attract different types of bees and butterflies and all of that. But what I kept going back to was when we first moved into our house 10 years ago, we knew nothing about landscaping, about plants, about anything. And it was just like, here's a plot of land. It's been taken care of, for 60 years. Now it's your turn. It's like, that's really overwhelming because I didn't want to like screw anything up. And we moved in February. And so it was just like, I had no real idea of what kind of plants we had other than from looking at Google Maps, like Google Street View, and being like, well, I see some purple things here. And it turned out it seemed like the previous landscaper, because we did have a company stop by and say, like, I took care of this property for 30 years. I thought that was really cool. But
Oh, wow. Yeah.
the purple coneflowers were kind of a focal point in the landscaping that he had put together for decades, where like we have a house that was built in the early 50s, so it kind of follows Frank Lloyd Wright style in the landscaping along with the house itself. And so he had kind of put these purple coneflowers throughout the yard as focal points. And at first I didn't really know a whole lot about them, but we started to notice how popular they were with the birds and the bees and the butterflies. And then we just started to get to know them more. And found that like these are the hardiest, like they'll grow as much as you allow them, and you can't really screw them up. And I love how they evolve through the season, where they start, with almost kind of the cone at the top is almost kind of flat, and then throughout the season it turns into almost like a big thimble like of spikes. And I just
Yeah.
think it's so neat how it changes a little bit every week. And then at the beginning of the season it's covered in bees, and then now at this time of year we still have finches and chickadees that are on
Oh.
the coneflowers eating from last year. And I love that it provides for the pollinators from its beginning to its death, and then however long I let it stay there dead, it'll
Yeah.
still give back. And I just think that's really cool.
Awesome. Well, that's really well said. A couple things that what you said came out to me. One, there's nothing like buying a house to make you learn more about plants. I had the same experience. I mean,
Yeah.
I was into plants before, but I never really had anywhere to grow them. And it wasn't until we bought this house that I just went full on, and now I have a podcast about plants. Uh, and then the second thing, which is I think really cool, is just that legacy of those plants in your house and how that those plants are still there from like at least 30 years ago, and plants kind of give like this interesting continuity to things, which I think is super cool. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, I kind of like to think about it that way too. It's interesting to think like how long ago were these initially planted that now they take up such a good chunk of the land. Like it's very fascinating.
Yeah, super cool. Do you have some fun facts and dazzling details about the purple coneflower, Echinacea purpurea?
Oh, purpurea. That's right. I tried to
Purpurea.
pronounce it
No,
and not great at my
mispronouncing.
Latin.
Yeah, mispronouncing those scientific names is definitely a theme on this show. So I do it all the time.
Well, something I really like with echinacea, I found, let me make sure I'm saying this as correctly as I can. Um, it comes from the Greek term, I think echinids, maybe, um, named for hedgehogs, where it's like in the middle, it's like a spiky hedgehog. And so that's
Oh
where the name
yeah.
actually comes from. And I thought that was really cool. And
Oh
I'll
right,
make sure
because
that I get the
there's that
correct spelling of that.
there's that animal from from Australia called the echidna, which is like a little
Yes,
hedgehog.
yes, exactly.
Ah,
Yes,
the same
exactly. So
root.
it's all,
Interesting.
yes. Yeah, like that's so interesting how language all ties back together, especially when you get back to the Latin, right? So
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool. And I have always found it interesting how important the plant was within indigenous cultures, especially in
Hmm.
North America, for its medicinal purposes. So, I've got like the tea that you can get from the store, but I
Hmm.
also like the idea of just being able to to dry your own echinacea and make your own tea. But I thought that was really interesting. I read that a pharmacist in, I want to say, 1925-ish said that it was the most popular herb at the time for like more than 100 years, which I thought was just interesting that like that was what people were using the most. And it's used to soothe like sore throats and help with coughs. And some people claim, it helps with other respiratory diseases, venereal diseases, all kinds of stuff. It's been used for centuries. I thought that was pretty cool.
That is really cool. Have you made tea with your own echinacea?
Yeah, and I walked around the property before this call to see if I could find any that had enough left of the petals and leaves to try to make tea for this podcast. But unfortunately, I'm a few months too late, I think, on that. But yeah, I'm a big fan of trying to grow, like I grow chamomile and different mints and stuff. And I just love the simplicity once you realize, because tea seems like a complicated thing, but then when you demystify it, it's like, oh, I just dry this hibiscus and I put it in hot water and that's
Yeah,
tea,
totally.
and that is the same with the purple coneflower echinacea, where it's so much simpler than what I had always imagined it would be.
So the what you make the tea out of with the coneflower is the petals and the leaves. Is that what you said?
Yeah, and that's how I've done it. Some people use the root,
Mm-hmm.
and I haven't done it with the root before. But basically, from everything that I've read about it, is that every part of the plant you can turn into tea.
Oh, okay.
There's, some interesting flavors that come from the different pieces and parts. And the root is what I think most people consider to be the most medicinally valuable,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of interesting because of that reason. It's an endangered plant in the wild
Oh,
because it's been like overly harvested. So it's just kind of interesting because in our property, it has not endangered. There is no problem with it just completely going wild. But it's interesting to think that like it's not as common to see in the wild and prairies as it once was because of over harvesting for the roots.
Interesting. This kind of leads into my weird story about purple coneflower, and this is entirely fictional, but it does make sense about why this was written. So, my wife is a lawyer, and when she was in law school, they had an imaginary case. It was not real, but they had to like do the whole process of figuring out like what is the right decision to make in this case. And the case was this imaginary case where there was some kind of religious group that wanted to harvest purple coneflowers from Shenandoah National Park, where that's illegal to harvest from, but they were trying to claim a religious exemption because it was their religion to do this. This is not true. It was just made up. But anyway, it was like one of the first things she ever did in law school, and it was like very torturous. And I feel like she has like a negative reaction anytime she hears the word purple coneflower now because of this imaginary case that they had to like. But hopefully we can get over that. I want to try to grow some of my own. But just on an aside, the reason why they did that case is because there is a real case where there was a religious group that I think is in the United States, but from somewhere in South America, that wanted to legally use ayahuasca in the United States. And there is this law called the religious, I think it's called RFRA. I forgot what it stands for. But anyway, I'm pretty sure they got special permission to use ayahuasca because of this law. And it went to the Supreme Court and everything. So they basically like modeled this fake case using purple coneflower as the flower that wanted to be used in an illegal way to kind of like have the law students test this idea of like religious exemptions in the Constitution. And so that's why whenever I hear purple coneflower just being the spouse of a lawyer and having her here, like the first time she really had to go through all this kind of legal thinking was centered on this flower. So, but it comes, the reason why I think they chose it is because of its, it has had problems of being illegally collected. And so that's why, yeah.
That's interesting, and I do have a quick tangent that I will share.
Yes, please.
That is not purple coneflower related, but is mock trial fake cases related.
Okay.
Where we have something in Ohio called Buckeye Girls State, where I think a lot of states do it. It's like to teach high school students civics and just like how government works, right? And so everyone runs for a different job within the state. And I ran for municipal judge, and so I got to hear cases about Amish people getting drunk and flipping their buggies over. So in a similar thing where I got to sit there in my judge robe and get to try and decide if they were guilty of DUI. And there was some religious stuff involved with that too. But it's just kind of interesting where like that sticks with me of sitting there in that
Uh-huh.
cheap plastic robe that they gave us to pretend to be judges. But yeah,
That's really funny.
purple coneflower, that's awesome that she winces when she hears it. I think I'm so sorry.
Scientific name, Echinacea purpurea. This purple coneflower can be cut into a potent feel-good herb. And, as usual, where there's feel-good herbs, there's crime. Jeannie Wiegum is a victim.
Early this spring, when I came out to tend this garden for the first time, there were a number of big holes where plants had obviously been taken.
The echinacea that was stolen from your garden, how much do you think that's worth on the open market?
20 cents.
Thank you for sharing about purple coneflower with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I was trying to think about what to choose, and sometimes I choose a plant that's related, or sometimes it's just one that I thought of. But there is a plant in my yard that is kind of a natural choice to choose, and you'll probably know. And the plant I chose is black-eyed Susan, which is also sometimes called a coneflower as well. And if you haven't seen that, as Laura described, listener, the purple coneflower has purple petals, and it kind of like inverts into this cone. And the black-eyed Susan does that too. Maybe not as much. I don't think it gets quite as coney as the purple coneflower. But it has yellow petals. And then it's also called, well, we're going to get into the name for a minute because there's I went on a whole rabbit hole about the name. But the most common reason why it's called black-eyed Susan is because in the middle of the flower, it's very dark, quite a bit darker than the purple coneflower, which I think is a little bit more brown and has some interesting color like gradients in the purple coneflower. Yeah. Is that fair to say? Whereas the black-eyed Susan is kind of like much darker in the middle, I'd say. And also a little smaller. I think the purple coneflower, that echidna part is quite a bit bigger than, but they look, when you see them next to each other, they kind of look similar. And at first I was like, and before I started doing my research about this, I think I knew this in the back of my head, but I just kind of assumed they were going to be in the same genus because they look so similar, but they're in fact not. So as you said, purple coneflower is Echinacea is the genus. The black-eyed Susan is Rudbeckia is the genus, which sounds funny. They are both, though, purple coneflower and brown-eyed Susan, both in the family Asteraceae, or Asteraceae, which is the daisy family, which is a massive, also sometimes called the sunflower family, a massive genus of flowers. At one point, or maybe, I'm not sure, the Asteraceae family is also sometimes called the Compositae family, because they are composite flowers. And I've talked about this in a previous episode, but when you look at a black-eyed Susan or when you look at a purple coneflower, the petals are actually called ray petals or ray florets, and the flowers are actually in that middle part. There's hundreds of little flowers in the middle, and so it is a composite flower. It is a flower that is made up of other little flowers. And so that's why they're called composite flowers.
That is so fascinating.
Yeah, and so sunflowers are like
cool.
that too. Any of those flowers you see that are in the daisy family, if you look at them close, you'll see that in the middle there's just a bunch of tiny little flowers, and those petals are not kind of how most plants have petals, which the petals are surrounding individual flowers. There's actually little tiny petals down there on the composite part, which is interesting.
Well, I look forward to studying all of our black-eyed Susans this summer then. That's cool.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Okay, so apparently the black-eyed Susan has similar traditional medical uses to Echinacea, but there's not as much information about that, and I'm not quite sure. So as I say on every episode, disclaimer to listeners, Rootbound can't endorse any medicinal use of anything, but apparently it has traditional uses. It is also from North America. It's from the same regions generally. It has a lot of traditional indigenous uses as well. This is one I didn't know. I'm right on the border of Maryland. It's the state flower of Maryland. The black-eyed Susan is the state flower of Maryland, which is interesting. And like the purple coneflower, the pollinators just super love it. And I never really thought about it the way you said it, but yeah, the bees love it early in the season, but yeah, the birds really love it later in the season when the seeds fill up that entire little seed head. So that is a really cool thing. So they have very similar, I think, niches in the environment. Okay. I go down too many rabbit holes about names of plants, and I really kind of went deep on this one. So let's just start. The easy one to explain is the scientific name, which is Rudbeckia hirta. That's Hirta. Hirta just means hairy because it has hairy stems, right? If you think about it. Rudbeckia is a funny one, and this is like this happens so much. The guy Carl Linnaeus, he's the guy who invented binomial nomenclature, like naming things two names. And because he's the guy who invented it, he just got to name a lot of the plants. He just decided. So Rudbeckia, the whole genus, is just named after his professor Olaf Rudbeck. He just decided to
Oh my gosh, I have so many different types of Rudbeckia plants in my yard, and I never knew that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So he was just like, my favorite professor. Yeah, I'm going to name a plant after you. You don't get to do that anymore. He'd be like, I don't know. He really just like cornered the market on naming all that stuff back in the day. So it has nothing to do with the plant. But yeah, Rudbeckia. Now, other names for the black-eyed Susan, it is also sometimes called brown-eyed Susan, which makes sense, brown Betty, gloriosa daisy, sometimes golden Jerusalem, apparently, English bullseye, poor land daisy, yellow oxeye daisy. I think most people just know it as the black-eyed Susan, maybe the brown-eyed Susan. And I was like, okay, why? Why Susan? Right? Like, what's the deal with that? Also, when I initially heard the name Black-Eyed Susan, I was like, is this some kind of like violent misogynistic thing? Because a black eye, but it's got, and luckily apparently it has no reference to that. It is just referring to the color of a woman's eye. So that's good. I was like, should I call this something different? And maybe Brown-Eyed Susan was trying to fight that, because I don't know. But still, I was like, okay, why Black-Eyed Susan? Why Susan? And so the first thing I found was this article in Grit magazine, which is a magazine for rural America. And it was written by someone named Mary Pellerito. And she talks about this poem by a guy named John Gay, who was English poet, born 1685 and died 1732. And he has a poem that's called Black-Eyed Susan. And in this poem, this character, Black-Eyed Susan, boards a ship to find her lover who is about to go to sea to wish him farewell. And interestingly, her boyfriend is referred to as Sweet William, which there's also flowers called Sweet Williams. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. So they probably named this flower after this character in the story. But it is interesting, these two different flowers that apparently get their name from the story, because one is native to North America and one is native to like Asia and Europe. And they probably were growing around each other because the flowers are gone, but it seems like kind of a strange pair. So I'm like, what? I was like, I want to find out why, like who decided we're going to call this one Black-Eyed Susan? Like where was it first written down? And this is where the internet starts to fail us. I feel like
No.
I feel like Google is broken in a lot of ways, because when you try to find something, you just find the same people repeating the same facts over and over again. So everyone's like, every blog, when you just start Googling, is like, it's called Black-Eyed Susan, probably because there's this poem called Black-Eyed Susan, and then that's it. There's no like deeper digging, like who decided to call it that, what happened. Okay. So I went down this rabbit hole, and I still haven't found a positive answer, but I think I've gotten further than most other people on the internet so far. So one thing I've done a number of times on this podcast when I go down my rabbit holes is I go to Google Books, because Google has scanned in all these really old books, and it's really great for horticulture stuff because there are old books about horticulture. Other topics may not be as good, but I feel like plants are is pretty good, and the search is pretty good. So I searched for just Black-Eyed Susan, and I tried to go back as far as possible. And I found three interesting things, which I think might help us understand a little bit how Rudbeckia hirta started to become known as Black-Eyed Susan, even though it's not perfect. So the first thing I found was from a magazine of horticulture from 1860, and in the section on peas, which shout out to our friend Ashley, who has a fear of peas, but in the section about peas, it's talking about a pea called Lynn's prolific wrinkled pea, which is a funny name. Laura almost did a spit take.
Fantastic.
Sorry to say that name of a pea when you were drinking. But it goes on to describe Lynn's prolific wrinkled pea. I'm sorry. I just noticed the name of the company selling Lynn's prolific wrinkled pea is called Nut. It's called Nutting
Wait,
and Son.
what's it called?
Nutting and Son.
What? No. Amazing.
Anyway, it's describing this pea, and then at the end it says the helium is marked with a small black speck, as in the worthless egg pea.
Oh my
I'm sorry,
God.
I'm losing it. As in the worthless egg pea, sometimes called black-eyed Susan. So they were calling the worthless egg pea the black-eyed Susan pea, which I can't tell what pea that is. Maybe that's a black-eyed pea, which is also called the black-eyed Susan. But this was like, aha. They weren't only calling Rudbeckia hirta black-eyed Susan. They were calling other things black-eyed Susan. Okay, that's cool. But this is maybe a little bit more confusing because, like, why there's multiple things. So then I was reading a little bit more, and then I found another thing from 1847, which is a florist's manual, and talking about the kinds of things they sell. And this one mentions in a section of the kinds of flowers they have a group of flowers called pinks, and it lists different varieties of pinks, which is the name of the flower. And one of those varieties is called black-eyed Susan. And this says this is, and it describes this other flower. I was like, well, what's a pink? That's very normal flower. Well, it says a pink is another name for dianthus flowers, and Sweet William is a dianthus. So at some point, there was a dianthus called Black-Eyed Susan and a dianthus called Sweet William, referencing this poem, right? So that makes sense to me when you're naming varieties of dianthus. You say, oh, I know this poem, and this one has a black center, and this one, so let's name them. Okay. So at some point, they were naming, things like this. And what this made me start thinking is that this poem in England was pretty popular at the time. Like, people knew the reference to Black-Eyed Susan. And then finally, I found another reference to this, and I can't believe I couldn't find this searching earlier, but there is another plant that's called the Black-Eyed Susan vine. And this is a plant that's from Africa, and it's a vine that covers, and the flowers look pretty similar to Black-Eyed Susan, but they're covered in this vine. And I'll read this kind of short thing here about that vine, which I found in a thing called the Family Cyclopedia from like 1850 something. It says the Black-Eyed Susan vine is Thunbergia alata, so named in honor of C.P. Thunberg, a celebrated Swiss traveler and botanist, and is native to the East Indies. Its seeds were first sent to this country, talking about England, by the distinguished Mr. Telfair from the Mauritius in 1823. It's climbing plant rising to the height of 8 feet, blah, 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 blah. And then it says, beautiful but not gaudy, rich without orientation, and modest as burns, wee crimson-tipped flower, the mountain daisy, in a moment of happy inspiration, a worthy gardener gave this plant the truly appropriate and English name, Black-Eyed Susan. So I think Black-Eyed Susan is an English name because of the poem, and it just became a way to call flowers. And when you see, if you're someone who's from English, if you're someone who's English, you see the Black-Eyed Susan either imported to Europe or you see it in North America. It looks like this vine that was called the Black-Eyed Susan. It's referencing the poem, and so that's my theory: is that there's been many flowers that have been called Black-Eyed Susan because of the poem, and so it just kind of stuck to our Black-Eyed Susan, and now that is the most famous Black-Eyed Susan, even though at one point they were just calling any flower that had a little black center Black-Eyed Susan. That's my best I can tell. I still haven't proved it, but I did think it very interesting that this poem, which also mentions Sweet William, and there was a dianthus called Black-Eyed Susan. That makes me think that that's kind of where it started, is marketing of plants based off of this poem. That's what I got. That was my journey with the name.
That's fascinating. So do you think, given Nutting and Sons or whatever, was Black-Eyed Susan like a derogatory term at some point? Like, we'd be like, oh, this wrinkled pea, she's just a Black-Eyed Susan.
No,
was it an insult?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it is funny that they think the egg pea is worthless. That would seem to just be uncalled for.
You're like, why are you so rude?
Yeah, I just do think it has to do with the fact that this poem apparently was like the Mandalorian of its day or whatever. It was a very popular piece of entertainment, and people knew it, and they're like, "We're going to call this, the Mandalorian pea or whatever." Um, uh, they named it after this popular poem because it had a black speck. That's what it is, and it just kind of traveled from plant to plant where it was applicable, and for some reason, it has stuck on Rudbeckia hirta more so than I think most of these other ones. Maybe the vine is also as common. It's just we don't grow that here. It's more of a tropical plant, so we don't see the black-eyed Susan vine here. And now, particularly with the internet seems to solidify stuff even more. So now if you look for black-eyed Susan, you find Rudbeckia hirta, whereas I can only find one reference to a pea that is referred to as black-eyed Susan, and only one reference to a dianthus called black-eyed Susan, and those are in really weird old books. Like if you Google those, it doesn't reference it. And like that one article I mentioned earlier, she talks about there was one reference of like, well, maybe they called these two because they bloom around the same time, the Sweet William and the Black-eyed Susan, and it has the story of the love story between Black-eyed Susan and the Sweet William in the poem. But one's a plant from North America, one's a plant from Europe. That doesn't make as much sense as someone saying, oh, here is a dianthus that has a black eye in the middle, a black spot, and here is another dianthus, what we can call Sweet William. I'll market those blooming together as two characters from this famous poem. That makes more sense to me, but I didn't fully solve the problem. The problem. If I had a little more time, that's my problem with this podcast. I just want to keep going deeper and deeper, and then I don't have enough time. But I think the final thing to say about Black-eyed Susan is the other thing I try to search for, and this is really hard, and it's a bummer. I wanted to know like what is an indigenous name for this plant. This is a plant that's native to North America. And I couldn't find any reference. So audience, if you know what it has been called in the past, like pre-colonialism, because I would like to refer to it to that, because it has this very English name, but it's not a very English flower. And I mentioned in my episode about Jerusalem artichokes, which have a similar ridiculous name story. They're also from North America. They have been called, and there is some reference that they have been referred to as sunroot. So I think sunchoke is a better name for those. Maybe if you want to call them sunroot, but that might confuse them. But I think there is some I would like to start a movement to try to start referring to certain plants with more their native name and not this strange history of colonialism names that are very frankly confusing. Or we can just call them a purple coneflower, which is just descriptive.
I like the idea of that movement. I'm on board for sure. That's great.
The bummer is, unfortunately, a lot of these names have been, lost or are not shared, which is also fine. But yeah, I think it is good to try that. And the plants from Europe get to have their whole legacy. So yeah, that's what I have to say about Black-eyed Susan. It's a cool flower. I like it. It grows in my garden. And has a weird name history. And sorry I lost it there with that Lynn's prolific wrinkled pea story. That was
so funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's man. Last summer I was at the nursery and there's a sign for and apologies, but Harry Ball's milkweed. And I was like, well, I can't not buy that. And so I put that in the giant pot at our front door, and it is the descriptor. The name is right on, and it is just insane. But I lost it at the nursery where my whole family's giggling, and the guy working was just like, wow, guys, you're maybe take it down a notch.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've seen that one. I think that goes around the internet every now and then. It's really fun. I think you're growing in your front porch and you get to explain to everybody about that milkweed. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, very good. Well, thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound. It was a lot of fun chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate it.
All in the downs the fleet lay moored. She was waiting in the wind when Black-eyed Susan came on board, saying, where shall I my true love find? Tell me, jovial sailors, tell me true, does my sweet William sail among your crew? Willie, who high upon the yard, rocked by the billows to and fro, Soon as her well-known voice he heard, he sighed and cast his eyes below. The chords glide swiftly through his glowing hands, and quicker than lightning on the deck he stands. Oh, Susan, Susan, lovely dear, my vows will ever true remain. Let me kiss off those falling tears, we only part to meet again. Change as ye list ye winds, my heart shall be the faithful compass that shall point to thee. The landsmen say they'll try to tempt thy constant mind. They'll say that sailors wend away, in every port a mistress find. Yes, yes, believe them when they tell thee so, for thou art present wheresoe'er I go. To fair India's coast I sail, thine eyes are seen in diamonds bright. Thy breath is Africa's spicy gale, thy skin is ivory so white. The pleasant breezes wheresoe'er they blow, they bring me memories of my lovely Sue. Boatswain gave the dreadful word, the sails their swelling bosom spread. No longer could she stay on board, she turned, she sighed, and hung her head. Her little boat unwilling rowed to land. Adieu, she cried. Adieu, she cried, and waved her lily hand.
That was a musical version of the poem Black-Eyed Susan, written by John Gay and originally published in 1720, now performed by the American folk duo Anna and Elizabeth. You can find their music on Bandcamp, and that brings us to the end of the podcast for today. Thank you for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Laura Oldham. Laura is a website designer, plant propagandist, and founder of Return to Cinder, a business focused on sustainability, education, and resources. Learn more at returntocinder.club. If you're a fan of Rootbound and you want to help the podcast out, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways that you can help the show, including just leaving a rating review on your podcatcher of choice. You can probably just scroll down to the bottom of your phone right now. I would be so thankful. Rootbound is hosted by a man who believes no pea is worthless, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, create your own cultivar and give it some fun pop culture name.
Stinging nettles are available for a limited time. Restrictions apply. See plant for details. Void where prohibited. Abundance subject to change without notice. Stinging nettle available in 49 states. Sorry, Arkansas.